Well, welcome everyone. I think most people joined by now, but well, thanks for joining us here for this April SPDA meeting. And yeah, first of all, let me thank all the corporate sponsors that you can see here listed. And we're inviting other companies if you guys want to support what the SPDA is doing with these presentations, monthly meetings. Please reach out, and happy to welcome more sponsors. And then also thanks for all the individual members who are supporting us. At the bottom there, you can see the email where you can reach out and renew your membership or sign up to become new members. We've been very happy to see lots of new members also coming in from elsewhere other than Sudbury, being encouraged by all the good talks that we had. So thanks again for the support. And yeah, so today's presentation is Canada Nickel. And it was funny, earlier this year, we had a few really good gold talks, and we were thinking of switching a little bit to base metal again and inviting some heavy hitter nickel company. And we've got some experts here right in our backyard, and that was back in January, February. Nickel was kind of just reaching around $10 a pound, and there's a lot of talk about critical minerals and the need for battery and all that. And so yeah, we invited Canada Nickel to join us, and of course that was before the whole craziness of the recent nickel price action. And I was happy to see Mark at the BMO conference also. That was the first time again back in action after 2 years, being able to finally go to conferences. And yeah, and then I mean, since then, since Mark and Steve accepted to give the talk, they've had a pretty busy few weeks. They just raised $50 million, or a bit over $50 million last week. They also had some of the highest grade intersections, I think, announced at the deposit last week. So it's been it's a very timely presentation, I think. And then I'm very excited that Steve could also join, and we'll hear a bit more about the geology, geophysics, technical aspects of the deposit. So yeah, I think Mark and Steve probably don't need a lot of introduction. Most people are familiar with them, really experts in the nickel business. But yeah, Mark Selby, he's the CEO and chair of Canada Nickel, has been since inception, which was 2.5 years ago. Before that, of course, he was CEO of Royal Nickel, which again, a lot of you would know, partly because of the Dumont nickel project, which is it's a bit similar style, I guess, to the current deposit. And I think we might talk about that a little bit as well. But yeah, a lot of you would have heard about the Beta Hunt, in Australia and all the successes there. So, and before that, of course, he had management roles here in Sudbury. And yeah, so and then Steve is here as well. He's the VP Exploration of Canada Nickel. Also, has been with the company since inception, and of course he has decades of experience as geophysicist, looking for nickel deposits here in Sudbury, Voisey's Bay. He was involved. I know him back from when he was helping out with Wallbridge a little bit when we were making our Broken Hammer discovery here in Sudbury. So good memories there as well. So yeah, again, thanks Steve and Mark for joining us. I think for further ado, I'll just hand it over to you guys. Mark, Steve, the floor is yours. Thanks again.
Yeah, so Attila, thanks for the opportunity to speak. And again, thanks for everyone to listening in. There are very few groups in the world who really understand nickel, and this will be one of the few places in the world, who really have an in-depth knowledge of what nickel is all about. Steve and I are going to tag team back and forth as we go through the presentation. I pretend to be a lot of things, but I'll never pretend to be a geologist. So I will let Steve talk about that part of the presentation. But first part, I'm going to really focus in on, the analysts and the general mining investment community has really not done nickel a great service. It has always underestimated, what nickel demand could look like. And so as a result, every 15 to 20 years, we end up desperately short of nickel, and we go through these big super cycles. And again, with the EV demand growth story here, we're setting up for another super cycle coming the middle part of this decade. As someone who worked at Inco and has been down the bottom of Creighton and gets to hold, $1,000 rock, why are we spending our time, exploring for, $25 to $30 a ton rock? It's very fundamentally, the world needs large scale, scalable sources of nickel to be able to meet just the stainless steel demand growth that we need. But more importantly now, with the emergence of EVs, as a new huge source of potential nickel demand for decades, centuries to come, the ability to have large scale, low grade, low carbon nickel, that these low grade ultramafic nickel deposits whose waste rock and tailings likes to spontaneously absorb carbon, are really set up to be, the next generation of nickel supply. EV demand growth, there was a lot of talk for a long time, but that demand is here. We saw over 100% demand growth in the EV sector in 2021. Nickel demand grew at 15% per year. That was 3 to 5x what the other base metals were. And there was not a single analyst who was anywhere close to that in terms of what nickel demand would look like. In terms of the nickel industry ability to respond to that supply, for the last 6 years now, we've seen more than 100% of the supply growth come from high carbon Chinese controlled nickel in Indonesia. The rest of the world pipeline, we went through our last super cycle in the mid 2000s, and that basically emptied the project pipeline of a bunch of projects that have been sitting around for a long time. I know, and as someone who's carried around some very expensive rocks from Beta Hunt with some high grade gold, and again, been involved at Inco back in the day, high grade is great, but the reality is the last 1 million tons of contained nickel high grade discovery, and high grade I'm saying is more than 1%, was Voisey's Bay in 1994, it was 1992. The last high grade laterite discovery was back in the 1980s. All of the nickel that's coming from Indonesia right now was from deposits that Inco drilled off in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that were considered, quote, too low grade to make, in the wrong chemistry to make traditional ferronickel. And Tsingshan has now become one of the world's largest mining and steel companies in the world off the back of that resource that was developed by Inco back in the day. We're going to spend that time to set the stage, because again, we believe that these large, low-grade ultramafics, like we've got at Crawford, are really going to be the next generation of nickel. What's been exciting for us and exciting for Steve and I, over the last 12 months, Crawford on its own is the largest sulfide discovery since the early 1970s. We realized literally just about a year ago that this is going to be a very, very solid project, and before we keep hyping it, we should really make sure whether there's any other ultramafic deposits around Timmins. And so, using the provincial geophysical database, using the provincial historical drill database, we had 7 targets already, and we did 18 deals in the second half of last year to acquire another 13 targets. Again, Crawford on its own is the largest sulfide discovery since the early 1970s. These deposits, and Steve will explain why, have a very distinct geophysical footprint. We put together 40x the footprint that we've got for Crawford's main zone. Again, I get a lot of pushback from a lot of people in a lot of places. It's, oh, the grade's so low, the recovery's so low. Yes, it is. We put that out in black and white. We don't hide that. All of the numbers are based on that grade and that recovery, and the math works. The thing to realize is that once you get past the grade of what you're mining, exploration costs are lower because these are large disseminated ore bodies that you can have very wide space drilling to pull up. Because they're very large scale assets in terms of capital cost per ton of nickel, the development costs are a lot lower because these are large scale operations, your mining and milling costs are a fraction of what they are in Sudbury. And because the nickel content of the minerals that you're recovering have a much higher nickel tenor than your traditional pentlandite with a pile of iron sulfides, your downstream processing costs, which are a big component of the overall nickel chain, are lower as well. So yes, grades and recovery low, but all the way through the rest of the value chain, there's some very significant advantages. And again, nickel is just going to go where copper and oil and gas, in terms of either the oil sands or in terms of tight oil, tight gas, that's where nickel needs to go to be able to deliver the nickel that the market needs. Just some background on the company. We are founded 2.5 years ago. I met Steve in July 2019 after some investors phoned me up and said, hey, we've put 4 holes into something that we think could be another Dumont. Looking at that and knowing Steve understanding of geophysics and how much the geophysics can really unlock the value, we formed the company in September 2019. We drilled hole 5 in the deposit at that point, and 2.5 years later, we're at over at hole 220, I think, and we're on our way to have a full feasibility study complete by the end of the year. We traded it on the TSX. Again, with that template that we had, we ended up acquiring 20 separate targets in and around the Timmins nickel district. And we really do believe that we have a property that's going to rank up there with Sudbury, Western Australia, and Sulawesi in terms of the scale of nickel resource that we're going to unlock. First off, in terms of nickel demand, again, the analyst investor community has really let us down a bunch of times. Nickel demand just historically has grown at 4 or 5% a year. They always underestimate it. We've got this new source of demand from EVs. And so, we put this chart together 2 years ago, and it's probably now on the light side in terms of where EV penetration is going. But we need to more than double supply by 2030 versus where we were in 2020. Yes, Indonesia is going to bring a pile of projects on, but we need 2 million tons plus, 2 to 2.5 million tons plus to come from Indonesia to have any hope of balancing this market. The other big structural issue in the nickel space is all of the nickel supply growth, has come from these bars on the right-hand side where you've got a multiple of the carbon footprint of what sulfide deposits have. And, the Elon Musks and other EV makers of the world aren't investing all these money in terms of decarbonizing transportation to go and buy a pile of hard carbon nickel. So there really is a massive sulfide opportunity here going forward. The other thing that's got a lot more attention in the last 6 weeks is obviously the geopolitics. I had a similar version of the slide in the deck my first few years, really focusing on the concentration of nickel supply in just a few jurisdictions, which aren't always the most consumer friendly. I, to be honest, got a lot of yawns on this slide, so I stopped including it. What's happened in the last 6 weeks, has really driven that to the forefront. We really do have a massive nickel supply chain issue. Car makers today are not going to bet their entire business going forward on nickel coming from Chinese controlled parts of Indonesia, from places like Russia. And so, when you step back and you think, oh, there's only 1 million tons of nickel that's not coming from one of those 3 countries, the opportunity for a place like Canada, is tremendous. And the big question is, okay, if we're going to get 2 million tons of nickel, maybe from Indonesia, where best case is this other 500,000 to 1 million tons of nickel going to come from? The first issue we need to do is again, nickel supply from the rest of the world has been shrinking for the last 6 years. So it's year in, year out, been going down. And Canada has been no exception. It pains me to no end as someone who spent a lot of time back in 2005, 6, 7, working on trying to merge Inco and Falconbridge together, and unfortunately went to companies offshore. And today we've seen nickel mine production shrink from 257,000 tons in 2007 to literally less than half that number in 2021. And the country that was the world leader in nickel supply for decades is now just 4% of global supply. We need to change the way we think about it going forward. If you look at the individual operations in terms of, what's happened over that time, again, we've seen some pretty significant shrinkage in a bunch of operations during this time. And again, for EV consumers who are showing up in North America or showing up in Europe and say, please may we have some more nickel. The reality is that supply base has been shrinking, and as many of you know, all that production's already been committed to long-time consumers who will already pay a pretty decent premium for the kind of products that the old Inco and Falconbridge pump out. The reality of the project cupboard, this is why I got involved with RNC Minerals back with Dumont back in 2010, and why I was keen to form Canada Nickel when we did. The big price spike in the mid 2000s basically cleaned out a project cupboard that had a pile of laterite projects that have sat around for decades, and in some cases with Koniambo and Goro for nearly a century. Koniambo was an asset that was part of the merger, the creation of Inco in 1902. It took 100 years to get developed, and all those projects got developed at that time frame. Because those projects had been around for a long time and overhanging the market, we really did have an underinvestment in exploration and development of new nickel sulfides. And so, we already had a shortfall of good nickel projects in the mid 2000s. We're basically empty in terms of what's available to bring to market for the EV market going forward. On the laterite front, which is where most of the supply has come from, we have now already developed every saprolite deposit that has a sizable resource of 2% or better. The last high grade, and again, 2% or better average resource that was discovered, was in Tagang Tong in Burma back in the 80s. We have not made any major laterite, and again, given where they sit on surface with changes in vegetation, I'm not expecting to make any massive discoveries in that going forward. And again, the struggles with HPAL outside of Indonesia have not made it an attractive place, to attract more capital going forward. Sulfides, have a massive opportunity here to really step up, and Sudbury in Canada is really well positioned. And again, we think these large, low-grade ultramafics are going to play a key role here. It's standard technology, inherently less energy intensive, much less capital intensive, as you don't need to build a refinery effectively on top of a deposit, and in today's market, a much lower carbon footprint. Again, people get caught up with high grade. The last 1 million ton high grade discovery was Voisey's Bay in the early 90s. Anglo-Sakatti deposit is now there, so we've made two discoveries in 30 years. The two other better discoveries of this century, Nova Bollinger and Eagle, they'll already be mined out by the part of this mid-decade. And again, in terms of the scale of supply that we need to deliver to this market, nickel demand by the end of this year is going to be running at 3 million tons per annum. Voisey's Bay was the best discovery in a very long time. It will meet less than 1 year of nickel demand going forward. That's the scale of nickel discoveries that we need to make. Yes, these large low grades deposits are low grade, but they're large scale. You get multi-million ton deposits of contained nickel. They tend to be open pit mine mill operations. Those are very scalable. You buy more milling equipment, you buy more trucks, you make more nickel. In a place like Ontario, where the grid has a very low carbon footprint, you can have a very low carbon operation. Again, Ontario is a low political risk jurisdiction, and in places like where we are in Timmins, a massive advantage because we have all of the major infrastructure to build a big mining operation already in place. I kind of liken, we kind of squandered an opportunity back in the 2000s. People were very focused on high grade. And, again, over the last decade, it's been really high grade. And, liken it to Linus, instead of going out for Halloween and getting candy, waiting in the great pumpkin patch for the great pumpkin to arrive. Yes, it would be great to find a big high grade nickel discovery, but they're just not that common. If we, as a mining industry, if we as a country want to take advantage of the great opportunity that the EV market, has brought to us, we need to find those sources of nickel supply that can deliver the kind of volume and scale that these markets need, and these large low-grade deposits are ideally suited. Crawford, based on our PEA, would be the 5th largest operation globally if we are fully ramped up. We'd be the largest base metal operation in Canada again today if we were fully ramped up. You know, these are the kind of scale of deposits that the market needs going forward. And with that, I'll leave Steve to drive it from here.
So if you were looking to explore or find a deposit somewhere in Canada, I think you would want to be either near Sudbury, Ontario, or Timmins, Ontario. Timmins has a very well-trained mining group, world-class infrastructure in terms of highways, railroads, electricity, major support infrastructure is already in place. Of course, a rich mining history and a long history of resource development. Plus, the close proximity of contractors and producing mines means that we don't have to start from scratch. So if you look at some of our properties, we're north of Sudbury, Ontario, which you can see in this image of the total magnetic intensity here. Sudbury shows up beautifully to the south. To the northeast of that is the Temagami anomaly, which has always confused a lot of people, probably not people like Bill Morris who have studied remnant magnetization. But as you move forward to Timmins, Ontario, you see there are a lot of speckles, small speckles of high magnetic intensity, and that's really what we're focusing on. So I'm going to zoom into that black rectangle and show you the total magnetic intensity of the Timmins area. You can see there are a lot of magnetic highs, particularly north of Timmins, which are related to highly serpentinized ultramafic rocks. Most of these we've since acquired during 2021. And our flagship property, of course, is Crawford, in which we have 3 deposits, which we've been delineating. But within about 30 kilometers of Crawford, we also have 10 ultramafic deposits, which also have the same potential to hold 1 billion ton or more in nickel. As we can see here from the total magnetic intensity, again, these things stick out like a sore thumb because they're highly magnetic, but they're also extremely large. So what is a large tonnage, low-grade nickel deposit? We're looking for 1 billion tons or more of 0.25% nickel. We need at least 45% or more recoverable nickel, and it can contain other economic minerals, most commonly cobalt and platinum group metals like palladium and platinum and iron chromite. Also, these, because of their size, they're very efficient in exploration, meaning that you can drill widely spaced holes and almost the entire meterage goes directly into the assay. So if you were to contrast, say, our Timmins targets, which are 1 billion tons in size, to say one in Sudbury, our grades would be 0.25%, whereas in Sudbury they might be 2.5%. Our recovery might only be 45%, while in Sudbury they would be 90%. In Timmins we'll be open pit mining, while in Sudbury everything is now underground mining. And in terms of contained nickel and gross value in US dollars, this is where you can begin to appreciate the size of these deposits. We're roughly 3 times the value, the in situ value of a typical Sudbury underground deposit. And it doesn't matter what value we're using for the price of nickel. Here we used under $8 per pound because if we use $10 a pound, say, both go up proportionally. Now, another way to help you understand how much money we're talking about with an individual deposit, we're looking at gold and nickel a gold equivalent nickel deposit, for example, and these are just hypothetical examples. Here on the left, we have Detour River, which would be a 15 million ounce gold deposit, large tonnage, low grade, with an average grade of say 0.9 grams per ton gold and a 90% recovery, which would yield about 593 million tons of ore. And at an $1,830 price for gold, you'd have an in situ metal value of $27.5 billion. So if we used that in situ value and we created a hypothetical nickel deposit called Crawford Lake and had a grade of 0.25% and a recovery of 45%, the size of that deposit would have to be about 1.4 billion tons, and that's at a $7.75 nickel price. So you can see that a typical Timmins nickel deposit is equivalent to a 15 million ounce gold deposit, and we're thinking we might have 10 of these.
Now, one thing in terms of, again, I hear again, high grade, high grade, high grade. The key thing here is, high grade really doesn't mean it's economic. If you look across the nickel sector in terms of some of the high grade deposits, Mincor is the Australian company that owns the most nickel deposits in Australia. This is their June 2021 resource statement. You got 14 deposits with an average grade of 3% or better. And again, most people would be very happy to find any quantity of 3% nickel. The reality is most of those mines have been closed for at least 5 years. You now, with the increase in nickel prices and outlook, you've got one new discovery, Cassini, which is in production, and a second one that's now being underway. If you look in the basin itself, it's very sad. Again, as someone who has worked very hard to try and get Inco and Falconbridge together, the fact that Victor today is coming up to its silver anniversary. It's been 25 years since the big resource was finally outlined. That hasn't been developed. FNX made a great discovery with Victoria. We're sitting now for nearly a decade. Again, if high grade automatically meant high value, these things would be in production today. It's not the case. There's a lot of other variables that come into the mix, and grade is just one of them.
So let's look at the geology of these large tonnage, low grade nickel deposits. And here, this is just a cartoon, of course, but if you were to go and look at one of these deposits, which of course you couldn't because they're always covered in overburden because they're so easily eroded from surface, but we're generally looking for a closed system and a single magma pulse. We're looking for magnesium-rich komatiites. They're intrusive, about 2.7 billion years. We're not interested in the spinifex texture, which would mean extrusive rocks. So there's a combination of temperature, gravity settling, and chemistry going on here. And then you have to have a near complete serpentinization of the olivine, which liberates the nickel and the iron. And so if you start at the bottom of the deposit, you have a basal peridotite with a sharp contact with the country rocks. And then there's a gradational contact into the main dunite zone. That's the cumulate. I've heard people refer to this as a form of igneous sedimentation, which I find very descriptive. That's usually the thickest part of the ultramafic and the area where the nickel grades are the highest. Then overlying that, you have it grades into peridotite, then eventually to peroxenite, then a gabbro, and finally a diorite. And it's at the upper peridotite peroxenite boundary where you get these PGE reefs, which seem to be very consistent. And we've intersected these PGE zones pretty much in every hole where we drilled through this contact. So you're looking for something that's really big, a strike length of 2 to 3 kilometers in length or more. You want a thickness of at least 200 meters. In some cases, it's up to 1.2 kilometers. And we're drilling these things to depths of over 400 meters. And in some cases, we've drilled down to a kilometer, and we're still hitting the same kind of mineralization. And just to give you an idea of what a billion tons is, it's about 2.5 kilometers by 400 meters by 400 meters. These things are huge. The Crawford, which was our first discovery, was actually identified back in 1965 by INCO during an airborne magnetic and electromagnetic survey. And they drilled hole 25050, which is what caught our attention. It was over 400 meters of 0.25% nickel. In the 1970s, there was various different parties exploring, in part because the property was owned privately by Abitibi-Bowater. And in 2012, Noble Mineral Exploration acquired the property as part of a larger property package. And it was optioned to Spruce Ridge Resources in 2017. They drilled 4 holes, and 1801 intersected 0.26 nickel over 550 meters. And that's when Mark and I got involved formed a partnership here with Canada Nickel. Since then, we've drilled over 200 holes. We drilled over 100,000 meters, over 40,000 assays. We've identified a higher grade core and extended it, discovered a platinum groove metal reef. And we had an aggressive property expansion in 2021. And we'll show you some examples of that. Here, we're just showing you the total magnetic intensity, and you can see that these serpentinized ultramafics really stand out. And we've done not just magnetic surveys, but we've also done electromagnetic surveys. And these ultramafics are weakly conductive, but so is the overburden in the Timmins area. So they don't really stand out from the overburden response. One thing that really surprised us, though, was the airborne gravity work that we did. And on the right, we're showing the vertical gravity gradient. And to our surprise, the ultramafics show up as gravity lows due to the fact that they've been serpentinized and their densities have been lowered. And the gabbros, which are relatively unaltered, show up as gravity highs. And the peroxenite, peridotite contact where the PGMs are located kind of form a ring around this gravity high. And so that's been a really important survey method for identifying the PGM zone. In cross section, the zone is subvertical. You can see the central dunite where the higher grade shells form. It's really one major single pulse of magma, with the bottom would be to the left or to the south, and it's several hundred meters in thickness, with the dunite is up to a few hundred meters thick. So these deposits are extremely thick, and they extend to depths of over a kilometer. So after 6 months of drilling, we had identified our initial resource. And here we're showing some of the shells. It only took 6 months to get 600 million tons of resource, which is one of the benefits of drilling these zones, is that you're always drilling mineralization. We have an outer resource boundary with a different inner shells going from 0.25% to 0.3% and up to 0.35%. So we have 28 million tons of 0.35 in the inner shell. And the nice thing about Crawford is that the higher grade sits toward the center, which would make it very easy for open pit mining. In terms of the total tonnage, we're over 1 billion tons as of 13 months into our program, ending October 2020. Over 50% of that was measured and indicated. Again, it's another benefit of drilling these large, low grade, high tonnage deposits is that you get, you're rewarded so quickly in terms of your resource estimates.
Yeah, in terms of what the PA was based on, it was primarily our main zone resource in the green area there. You can see since that time, this is our latest map of our latest set of assays and the drilling that's taken place, and you can see that the mineralization's been significantly extended to the northwest. The big, very pleasant surprise for us was our east zone. That today is now 2.8 kilometers long. It's a third longer than our last update. And we've had this nice high-grade core show up. And as Attila mentioned in the opening there, and thanks for the plug, is we hit our best interval to date at 0.7% nickel over 64 meters, and even got a little bit of nickel over 1%. Again, we've been poking at this for just over 2 years, so there's a huge amount of potential upsides as we try and understand exactly how this mineralization has done. Again, the nice thing what happens in a very well serpentinized ore body with the right nickel to sulfur ratio is you can make a high grade concentrate. So one of the samples that came out of East Zone yielded a 55% nickel concentrate. That's basically almost matte, which is what effectively hazelwoodite is. In terms of the PGM core, as Steve mentioned, it happens at the contact between the dunite and the gabbro in the proxenite peridotite sequence. And again, for the most part, with very few exceptions, every time we poke a hole through there, we end up with consistent grades and thicknesses, all around that structure. And again, right now, that's not included in the resource at all. We'll be doing more drilling on this structure to get it up to a point where we can have it in the resource, because we will be mining that contact for the most part near the main zone and the east zone as we move forward. Yeah, so in terms of serpentinization, basically, you're taking olivine with the nickel and iron in that lattice. And as it serpentinizes, both of those things become available. What happens is you get the olivine drops, you get a much higher concentration of serpentine. The nickel becomes available, and depending on whether sulfur is available or not, turns into pentlandite, hazelwoodite, and a warite. Again, depending on the conditions that occur, you can go all the way and get a carbonated mineral. But what we're really looking for is a very well serpentinized dunite going forward. In terms of what that looks like when you take a look, and I know I saw Lauren, who was part of the RNC team back in the day, and did a lot of work really understanding the process around serpentinization and what that meant in terms of the quality of the mineralization, and the ability to recover minerals. This is a process that happens at a molecular level, so you can end up with a lot of fine pentlandite, and anyone who's been involved in mineral processing knows fine pentlandite doesn't really recover well. But as it serpentinizes, those particles tend to agglomerate, and as you can see in this graphic here, as you go across the top and down the bottom, over time you get these nice, sizable particles of hazelwoodite and magnetite, which are very, very recoverable going forward. In places where you don't have any sulfur available, then you get a warite being formed. And again, here are some examples of the olivine breaking down, which is in orange. And as it's breaking down in an environment where you have very little sulfur, you end up with these warite particles being formed, which again, FPX Minerals in BC has a deposit, that is effectively largely a warite. In our case, we have quite a bit of sulfur in the system, so most of our recoverable mineralization is in the form of hazelwoodite and pentlandite. Again, with these types of deposits, the nickel assay, is just a number. What you really need to understand is how much of that nickel is in a recoverable mineral. So from day one, we started doing the mineralogy work to really understand what the deportment of that nickel is across various minerals. And as well, in our case, we make a magnetite chrome product because we have a significant amount of magnetite and a significant amount of chrome, which we're able to recover in the flow sheet. In terms of the minerals, what's a massive help here is again, your typical nickel sulfide deposit is pentlandite with a pile of iron sulfides, which you can't separate in the mill, and you end up with a 10 to 15% concentrate. In our case, we have very little to no iron sulfide throughout most of the deposit, and so we are pulling basically these three minerals with a little bit of serpentine associated with it. Because of that and the grades on the nickel tenor of these minerals, we can produce a very, very high grade concentrate. So for the PEA, we're targeting 35%. We've been able to achieve it in some samples that are high hazelwoodite, anywhere from 40 to 55% nickel concentrates. And again, yes, the grade is low, the recovery is low, but in terms of the overall cost equation, that downstream processing is a massive part of the overall value chain. And so the ability to have a high grade concentrate is a very, very valuable characteristic. You can see the top, other than Voisey's Bay, the other three top there are all ultramafic deposits. Mount Keith, when it got started, which is the grandparent of these deposits, produced a 25% concentrate. And so, we expect to make a very high tenor one, and another one that's got a bunch of magnetite as opposed to a bunch of iron sulfide with it. We've done a pile of work on the recoveries and have seen anywhere from a 6 to 16% improvement. We're targeting at least 4 to 5. Each one of those is worth nearly $100 million US. The big plus, and again, why these class of deposits is really going to stand out, is the fact that serpentine rock, which you see in the picture on the top here, when it's exposed to air, it spontaneously absorbs CO2 and converts itself to magnesite. In today's environment on carbon capture and low carbon, zero carbon, that's an extremely, extremely valuable property. And we believe, with the test work that we've been doing, that we've got the opportunity here to not only be a zero carbon operation, which we need to get 4.5 kilos of CO2 per ton of tailings, but be in a place, we're able to capture 8 to 10 kilos of CO2, where we actually have carbon credits available for sale. Crawford, this is a chart we stole from the Valley presentation in 2015. They plotted all the sulfide discoveries up to that point, and you can see Crawford today is the largest sulfide discovery, since the early 1970s. And with the feasibility study coming out, we expect a pretty sizable, and resource update in Q2, a pretty sizable increase on that going forward. With that, we've got one Crawford. We think we've got a half a dozen Crawfords in this deposit going forward.
So if you look at this plan map of the Timmins area, you can see some of our property holdings. We looked for everything within a 100-kilometer radius of Timmins. And if you go to the south, you'll see Sothman, Midlothian, and Powell. Those are three ultramafic intrusions that we acquired. Closer to Timmins, just to the south, you'll see Deloro, another ultramafic. Further to the north, about 20 kilometers north of Timmins, you'll see our Crawford Main deposit, Mahaffey, Nesbitt, Kingsmill, Bradburn, McDermott, Rayum, Man, which has three distinct ultramafics, Stimson, Mortimer, Moody. So we have a lot of ultramafic intrusions in our portfolio.
Yeah, in terms of with the geophysical footprint, we then looked into the historical drilling records, and what was surprising for us is how many of these did have either drilling in the 50s and 60s where they necessarily didn't assay but logged the core, that did a very clear job of delineating what we were looking for, serpentinized dunite with lots of visible magnetite and mentions of fine disseminated sulfides. And in certain cases, with Deloro, Midlothian, and the Man properties, where there were some select assays that were done, that had enriched nickel levels of north of 0.3. Some of them are we calling our untested giants, again, from the geophysics, which were, right on the mark in terms of what we drilled with Crawford. We think some of these could be very, very sizable, even larger than Crawford in terms of the potential that's there. Just quickly stepping through them, you can see, Sothman we picked up from Glencore. They pin cushioned, prior owners who pin cushioned a small high grade resource in the northwest. but left the main ultramafic largely untested. And just to the northwest of us is a company called Aston Minerals, which has made a very nice discovery. We wanted that one. They said, no, thanks. And, you know, it's turned into another Crawford discovery. And, you know, we're excited about it because it confirms that our targeting approach for the other, you know, 19 properties that we have, you know, is likely very spot on. Doloro had some good intervals. Was one of the first places we've started drilling. We've seen what we've wanted to seen there. Midlothian, again, outlined a very sizable serpentinized dunite, peridotite already delineated, only a few assays, but again, in the kind of right nickel grade that we're looking for. With Man, there's a whole series of ultramafic intrusions, some of them more or less tested than others, but again, you know, the right kind of logging that we've seen, and in places where they've done some assays, you know, the right kind of assays going forward, both in the northwest, central, and the southeast in terms of what's been there. Rayom, again, another big structure of dunite peridotite, and we're curious to see, you know, exactly what the mineralization it looks like, because none of these holes had any assays associated with them in the main intrusion. You know, fundamentally, you know, we are very confident that we are unlocking a nickel district that is of the scale of the half dozen regions, you know, where the bulk of the world's nickel is concentrated, both in terms of supply and the resource base. You know, nickel value creation, yes, Voisey's Bay in the 90s, you know, was made Mr. Friedland very rich, you know, but the reality is, in terms of the real scale, you know, Inco was created because it figured out how to separate nickel from copper and took advantage of some deposits in Sudbury that have been largely sitting around for 20 years, just in time for World War I to come along, which needed a lot of nickel. Qingshan was a tiny, small stainless producer in central China. You know, they realized that China needed a lot of 304 stainless steel, thought that the best way to do that was to drop a stainless steel plant on top of a laterite deposit rather than making ferronickel. And they basically, you know, that is a $50 to $100 billion business today that took a bunch of deposits that were drilled off by Inco in the 1960s and early 70s that were, quote, too low grade, the wrong chemistry to make traditional ferronickel. And they've built a multi-billion dollar business off of that in just 15 years. We think these large, low-grade ultramafics, you know, that can create a low-carbon nickel product when the market is desperate for a low-carbon nickel product, you know, is really going to be the next generation of supply, and Crawford is just going to be the first deposit of that. We've got our financing done. We've just filed the permitting documents to get that going. We'll have a resource update at the end of Q2, feasibility study at Q4. And so, you know, we're rapidly advancing this project towards production. I'd like to thank everybody for your time. I realize we ran a little bit over, but we'd be glad to answer any questions that anybody has. And thanks again.
Well, thanks a lot. I didn't even notice the time. It was very, it was a lot of fun. Great talk, and very smooth execution. Apart from the metallurgy, which neither one of you wanted to talk about, it was an awesome job tag teaming. It was
my fault.
No, really good.
I don't imitate geologists well.
Yeah. No, I don't want to talk about metallurgy too much either, as I can't blame a geophysicist not wanting to talk about it. Yeah, so I encourage everyone to, you know, if you have any questions down at the chat function, you can enter them in and I can moderate them, or, you know, raise your hands, you can go off mute. But yeah, maybe yeah, I'm definitely, you got me definitely converted here. So I'm quite, you know, obviously in the past, everybody knew about some of these smaller, higher grade, you know, deposits in Timmins related to the chromatites. But yeah, I think we definitely this kind of a paradigm shift in the nickel industry, because like you said, I mean, I've been in Sudbury for about 15 years now, and you know, there's a lot of whining and lamenting going about, you know, not finding other nickel deposits in Canada, and you know, we're sort of regurgitating a lot of the old Inco and Falconbridge showings. But this is, yeah, I think, like you said, you know, what the copper industry did with the porphyry deposits, and then, you know, we've seen that in the gold space, where over a few years, so these deposits were rethought, like, Canadian Malartic and Detour Lake, and switching to this, below a gram, large open pit type deposits. So that's kind of what we seem to need in the nickel space. So that's, really kudos for, and I like this term uncoveries, that, it's really, it just needs a bit of rethinking, and yeah, some of these neglected places become, and I mean, we've seen that now in just over 2 years. The kind of value you guys have created with kind of the nickel is pretty amazing. So yeah, congratulations on that. Yeah, so there's a few questions starting to come in. Yeah, about the resource model, I guess. Which consulting group did it?
Yeah, we've been working with Geological Creek since the beginning. So
yeah,
and they've been super helpful and have done a great job to date, for sure.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah. Okay, Richard Smith here talking about Aerotem data. Steve?
Yeah, so Richard, if you look at what was called Project 81, which is owned by Noble Minerals, which we acquired 2 townships from, most of that was flown with Aerotem, which is basically the Aerotem system. That data is all available. In 2018, we flew Crawford and Carnegie townships with south to north lines, 100-meter line spacing. That data is also available. So we have quite a bit of airborne EM data. These deposit types, they tend to be, they have an electromagnetic response, but they tend to be very low conductance. And so they have a response that is similar to the conductive overburden in the Timmins area. So they're, we do see peaks over top of the ultramafics, but they don't stand out like, say, massive sulfide deposit would normally.
And then Bill had a follow-up question on FDEM data.
Bill, I don't know whether we have any FDEM data. By FDDM, I assume you mean helicopter frequency domain EM systems?
Yeah.
And I don't think we do. I haven't seen any, to be honest.
I would do it.
Yeah, it might be interesting to do. Of course, a lot of these townships were privately owned, and so they were never subject to these large airborne surveys that have now found their way into the public domain through, say, Operation Treasure Hunt and so on.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the EM data that we've acquired, other than what INCO had, is not in the public domain, of course.
Especially when you started looking for magnetite.
Yeah, that would show up very strongly. I mean, if you look at the ultramafics, they tend to have a magnetic intensity of around 6,000 nanoteslas. So they're incredibly magnetic.
It's going back to the old, oh gosh, what's the name? The old frequency domain EM, where you look at negative in phase and actually end up mapping magnetite variations.
Yeah, Doug Fraser and yeah.
It works like a charm.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that would work nicely.
And you can send it my way as well.
Okay.
You send us the money and we'll send you the data.
You send me the money. I'm a poor retired professor now,
Oh, you guys are, yeah, I know what you're saying. So Lionel Bonhomme
question about the PGM layer. I don't know have you ever drilled through it even, or is there any?
No, we've drilled through it several times, yeah. And you can't really estimate the width of the PGM layer because it's fairly thin relative to everything else that's going on. But what you can do is you can see the contact between the basically unaltered gabbro, which has a high density, and the ultramafics, which initially we thought the ultramafics would have a high density as well. But as it turns out, when they're serpentinized, and soaked with water, their density drops down to below that of the country volcanics. So they show beautifully as density lows. And actually, we were initially drilling on gravity lows and finding those were the areas of higher assay. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah, you can say that.
Okay,
It's okay.
so the correlation was quite amazing, in fact, and so that was something we were keeping under our hat for a while, but it looks like it's out there now. But you can't estimate the width of the PGM layer because it's so narrow. It just doesn't have a response on its own, but it's incredibly consistent when you get in there. And I had mentioned that these zones are part temperature, part gravity settling, and part chemistry. And I think that the PGM zone is the chemistry part. Something is happening, and it's happening at exactly the same spot every time. And the PGE is settling out at that point.
So like a reef, PGE reef.
Yeah, it is a reef. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
is it
that
part of
also-
the resource estimate right now, or is
No,
it?
it's outside.
Okay, yeah.
that
all
also
bonus.
that also leads into the whole bushveld thing, you know, and then PGEs and bushveld are very closely associated to magnetite. So borehole magnetics.
Yeah, we've been talking about that. I know a guy who has a magnetometer.
Yeah, and the other part too, I'm secretly hoping, you know, if you look at Ivanplatz, where the reef kind of then turned and sort of plateaued and got really thick, we haven't drilled down there yet. So
Yeah.
fingers crossed that we might see one of those at some point. Yeah, and in terms of the gravity, what Steve was talking about, I saw John Korzak on the line, who's also part of the RNC Minerals team. And, you know, we did a pile of, you know, part of the reason we've been able to move very quickly and aggressively is, you know, the RNC team did a lot of really good work to understand how, you know, the relationship of recovery to mineralogy to some sort of, to some fundamental geological information. And what was amazing, you know, kind of by the end of all the work that we did, you know, when you look at the first derivative magnetic intensity, and you looked at, you know, the gravity in terms of the degree of serpentinization, you know, those things did really, really line up in terms of really helping you vector in terms of the, you know, the best quality, information. So, you know, when I met Steve for the first time, and they had these 4 holes, and they had done the gravity work and they'd done the mag work, and it was clear that there was a very large, well serpentinized body that these drill holes had gone through. It was very easy for me to say, yeah, I'm all in, and here's a pile of my own money, and let's go find a great big nickel deposit, which has worked out pretty well so far. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. So is there? I realize you guys have your hands full with the 19 projects, but you know, is there anything special about these ultramafics north of Timmins, these komatiites, or would the ones south of Timmins be just as good, or elsewhere in the Abitibi, you know, the other komatiites? Like, I don't know, have you done this kind of evaluation of the different ultramafic suites, komatiites?
We have all the good ones, Attila.
Yeah, I call it the magic map. And once there's a few things we'd still like to own that we don't yet. Aston Minerals was one of them, and they've hit a nice deposit there just north of us in Southman. But you know, we were able to basically anchor it with Dumont in the east and Crawford in the west, and then literally worked our way through all of the targets that emerged there. You know, again, I'm not sure why. There's I think a few PhD papers as to why these were all so consistently, you know, and again, we'll find out as we drill them, but our expectation is, you know, we'll see a lot of very well serpentinized ultramafics here. You know, why that occurred in Timmins, because again, I don't think you see it. There's lots of ultramafic rock in lots of places in the world. I don't think you see it that well, you know, all of them that well serpentinized. So,
okay, so we'll
see as we go here. Yeah,
Serpentinization is one of the keys, but the other thing is you don't want too much metamorphism to get into the rocks. So, you know, when the rocks become highly silicious, or if they're intersected by too many dikes, or if they're near shear zones, or if there's a nearby intrusion. These all kind of work against that. And the nice thing about Dumont, if you look at it, there's nothing around Dumont. It's just an ultramafic sitting in the middle of nowhere. And to some extent, Crawford is like that too. So ideally, you want that. You want a nice ultramafic with nothing around it. Now, that's not really possible, but we have found a few of them. And we've also found some ultramafics that are kind of near certain things that, as it turns out, don't really affect the intrusions that much. Those are things we'll keep close to our vest for now. But then there are other things that we're seeing that just don't make any sense to us. Like at Sothman, if you look at Sothman, there's 2.2 or 2.4 kilometers of nice ultramafic that looks like it's going to have what we want. There were a few holes poked into it, but on the western side, there's this higher grade zone. And where did that come from? I mean, it doesn't make sense that it's there. It looks a bit like a feeder tube. It is definitely connected to the larger ultramafic, but it doesn't seem to have affected it at all. And these are the kinds of things that we would love to find for these little high-grade zones nearby a large ultramafic, because they would be sweeteners to our project.
Yeah, sweeteners to the open pit. So you're not looking for a beta hunt gold situation. You want a quiet ultramafic that wasn't affected by the later orogenic processes.
Exactly.
Okay, so yeah, so
no meteorites. No meteorites.
Ed has a question here about silicate nickel.
Yeah, no, there's sort of actually several streams of work going on that front. So first off, the U.S. Department of Energy has and the government has an ARPA research program around carbonation of ultramafic rock and the potential of that to help unlock various minerals. So they're using that as a way. If you basically carbonate the rocks and help serpentinize the rock, in situ, can you then extract some of the value, convert it into valuable mineral and extract it? So that's one whole pile of research. Again, that's all lab scale type research. I think the only, they've been able to do it in places that are, entirely uneconomic in terms of the conditions that are required. But there is literally, a huge amounts of money that the U.S. government's pumping into that. Number two, people are looking at basic leaches in terms of, instead of using sulfuric acid and a low pH environment. There's been some work recently over the last 5 or 6 years looking at high pH environments, which again, don't understand exactly what the mechanisms are, but in an ability to be able to extract some of the nickel that way, because there's the unrecoverable portion of the nickel is in two parts. One is you have some nickel that's actually still in the serpentine lattice, and so you'd need to break the lattice or somehow corrode the mineral out of that lattice to get it. But the other part of it is, again, the serpentinization process. Basically it starts at a molecular level. So you get a pile of extremely fine serpentine micron type particles that you're never going to get by flotation. But in a some sort of leach environment, those kind of particles could become available and work on that front. But again, it's all still pretty lab scale at this point. Yeah, in terms of autoclaving, again, I think there's certain, there are people playing around with certain operating conditions, some of which one might be there. I think the difference here is, if you're playing with a gold deposit that's 1 or 2 gram and you're dealing with refractory rock that's worth $50 to $100, it's the capex trade-off to do something like that on $20 to $30 rock might be hard. So it would be sort of tank leaching or heap leaching type approaches to be able to get that kind of nickel out.
Talking about serpentine, is there any worry of asbestos, or I think some of the Timmins deposits had that in the past?
Yeah, you always have in any of these serpentine deposits, there's always a little bit of asbestos. The good thing is, unlike an underground environment, in an open pit environment, as long as it stays wet, it's not an issue. And again, that carbon sequestration process, where it absorbs CO2, actually helps cement a lot of those fibers together. So again, in nickel, Sudbury is the exception. Other than the massive sulfide deposits everywhere else, whether it's Thompson, Birch Tree, and a bunch of the ultramafics there, Raglan, the Beta Hunt, we had our asbestos procedures there. So, something the industry doesn't put up in lights. And again, our rock formation has a little bit of asbestos in it, but it's pretty manageable at the concentrations that it shows up in.
Nothing unusual, yeah. Yeah, so okay, so $50 million was just raised recently. So drilling is, I guess, is not stopping anytime soon. It's still going to be mainly resource drilling, or now you're starting to test some of these other targets that you were showing, or what's the main focus?
Yeah, so the money's basically three focuses. So one is, feasibility study done by year end. Number two, in terms of permitting, there's a bunch of test work that is front loaded. And so you'll be in terms of, being able to get the environmental impact statement together. So that's the second piece. And then on the exploration front, there's kind of part A and part B. Part A is, again, continuing to delineate and upgrade the resource and the main Crawford deposits. But then secondly, again, the scale of the cash we were able to raise, is going to allow us to take some more aggressive pokes around the rest of the regional properties to really highlight the exploration potential of what's there. So, as soon as we get through the melt up here, and we've got some new First Nations that we've got to get some exploration agreements in place. Once those are in place, we'll be hitting that property package pretty hard, and hopefully, being able to point to more than a few Crawfords, by the end of this year.
Okay, well, it's exciting, yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask about the environmental. I guess, yeah, for the feasibility, there's quite a lot of environmental to do, I guess, especially for a large open pit project like this.
Yeah, no, it's pretty good. And again, the good thing is, we've got members of our team who are involved in permitting Dumont, and again, there's a massive amount of similarities between the two deposits. So, we're pretty clear path in terms of what we need to do. And again, the good thing with these things is, yes, it is a big hole in the ground with big piles of rocks and tailings, but all of what you're mining is generally fairly benign. So, unlike most sulfide mines where you've got to worry about your tailings and waste rock and discharges to the environment, these minerals are, basically, if they show up to what they were at Dumont, they're non-deleterious as far as the environmental agencies are concerned. So, that gives you a massive amount of flexibility. It makes it a lot easier to get things permitted.
Yeah, not much acid generation.
Yeah.
And we're doing a lot in parallel too. So things are moving very quickly here.
Good. Well, exciting times. And so, yeah, you're up in Timmins right now. So I guess the drills are turning, and we can look forward to more news. And yeah, thanks again for the presentation, and all the best. Hopefully next time, a year from now, you can present the the feasibility results and all that in person at the Willett Green again.
Yeah, no, that would be great. No, thanks to everybody for taking the time. Very much appreciated. And seriously, go find some more ultramafics. It's the next generation. So
yeah. All right. Thanks.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks,
Yeah,
everyone.
have a good night.
Bye. Good
Take
night.
care. Bye-bye.